The letter was still shaking in Frank's hands when the Copa Room spotlight hit his face. 20 minutes until showtime, and some bastard had just delivered his death sentence on Sands Hotel stationery. But what the packed audience of high rollers, movie stars, and wise guys didn't know was that Frank Sinatra had been expecting this moment for 3 years. The envelope had arrived with his usual pre-show bourbon, Chivas Regal. Neat. 2 ice cubes. No messenger, no return address, just those 8 words written in block letters that made his blood run cold. "This will be your final song, Francis." Frank crushed the letter in his palm and looked at his reflection in the dressing room mirror. The blue eyes that had seduced half of Hollywood stared back at him, but tonight they carried something different. Tonight they carried fear. And in Frank Sinatra's world, fear was a luxury you couldn't afford. Not when you owed favors to Chicago, not when the FBI had your phones tapped, and definitely not when your own friends might be the ones holding the knife. The Copa Room was packed tighter than a sardine can. Dean Martin sat ringside with a blonde whose diamonds could fund a small country. Sammy Davis Jr. was working the crowd, his energy infectious even from backstage. But Frank's eyes kept drifting to table 7, the one where Johnny Rosselli sat with his stone-faced associates, their hands never straying far from their jacket pockets. 3 tables over, Frank spotted Agent William Carter nursing a scotch and pretending to read a newspaper. The feds and the family, all under one roof, all waiting for Frank to sing. His hands were steady now, they always were when death came calling. Frank had learned that lesson in Hoboken when neighborhood bullies thought the skinny Italian kid with the big voice would be an easy target. They'd been wrong then, and whoever sent this letter was wrong now. Frank Sinatra didn't run from fights, even when the odds were stacked against him like a rigged deck of cards. 5 minutes, Mr. Sen. Jilly Rizzo's voice boomed through the door. His bodyguard and closest friend since the early days, Jilly was the only person Frank trusted completely. But trust was a dangerous game in Vegas, and Frank had learned the hard way that even loyalty had a price tag. The year was 1966, and Frank's relationship with the mob had become more complicated than a jazz arrangement. He'd helped them launder money through the Calneva Lodge, introduced them to politicians, and kept his mouth shut when bodies started floating in Lake Tahoe. But the Chicago outfit was getting nervous about Frank's Hollywood connections, especially after that mess with Jack Kennedy. The president had used Frank to get close to the underworld, then cut him loose when the heat got too intense. Now Frank was caught in the middle, too dangerous for politics and too famous for the shadows. The threat letter wasn't signed, but Frank knew the handwriting. He'd seen it on loan documents, on contracts, and on death warrants. Sam Gancana, the Chicago boss who'd been like a brother to him, had finally decided Frank was more liability than asset. The man who'd helped Frank get out of his contract with Tommy Dorsey's band back in '43, who'd smoothed the way for his comeback in From Here to Eternity, who'd been his partner in countless schemes, had just sentenced him to death. Frank walked to the window and looked out at the Vegas Strip. The neon lights blazed like fallen stars, and somewhere in that electric jungle a killer was waiting for him to take the stage. But Frank Sinatra had never backed down from a challenge, not when Columbia Records dropped him, not when his voice gave out, and not when Ava Gardner broke his heart into a million pieces. He sure as hell wasn't going to start now. "Jilly," Frank called out. His friend appeared instantly, all 6'2" of Brooklyn muscle and loyalty. "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to not ask questions." Jilly nodded. In their world, blind faith was the only currency that mattered. Frank handed him a sealed envelope. Not the threat letter, but something else he'd been carrying for months. "If something happens to me tonight, you give this to Nancy. Not the lawyers, not the press. Just Nancy." His daughter was the only person in the world who could handle the truth about what her father had become. The envelope contained bank account numbers, safe deposit box keys, and a list of names that could bring down half of Washington and all of Las Vegas. But first you need to know about that night at the Sands Casino 3 months earlier, when Frank made the decision that sealed his fate. It was March 1966, and Frank was on a legendary winning streak at the blackjack tables. The chips were stacking up like skyscrapers, and the bourbon was flowing like the Colorado River. Dean was telling jokes, Sammy was doing impressions, and the Rat Pack was in full swing. That's when Carl Cohen, the Sands casino manager, made the mistake of trying to cut off Frank's credit. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sinatra, but casino policy." Cohen never finished the sentence. Frank's right hand connected with the man's jaw, sending him sprawling across the green felt table. Cards scattered like autumn leaves, and suddenly every eye in the casino was on Frank, including the eyes of FBI agent William Carter, who'd been nursing the same drink for 2 hours while photographing every face in the room. "Nobody tells Frank Sinatra when to stop gambling," Frank shouted loud enough for the hidden microphones to pick up every word. What he didn't know was that Cohen wasn't just a casino manager. He was also Sam Giancana's inside man at the Sands, and Frank had just humiliated him in front of half the Vegas underworld. The repercussions came swift and brutal. Within a week, Frank's credit was cut off at every major casino in town. His shows were mysteriously underbooked, and his usual table at the Copa Room was suddenly reserved for other guests. The message was clear. Frank Sinatra was no longer untouchable in Las Vegas. He was just another aging crooner who'd forgotten his place in the food chain. But Frank wasn't the type to take a beating lying down. He called in favors from coast to coast, leveraging his Hollywood connections and his friendship with Jack Kennedy to put pressure on the Chicago outfit. He threatened to spill everything he knew about the mob's Vegas operations unless his status was restored. It was a dangerous game of chess, and Frank had just put the king in check. The response came in the form of that letter 20 minutes before the most important performance of his life. Frank straightened his tie, a silk number that cost more than most people made in a month, and checked his watch. 15 minutes until showtime. In the distance, he could hear the house band warming up with "The Lady is a Tramp," one of his signature numbers. The irony wasn't lost on him. Tonight he might be singing it for the last time. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Frank called, expecting Jilly or maybe one of the Copa Room waitresses with another bourbon. Instead, Nancy Sinatra Jr. walked through the door, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed and her eyes filled with concern that she was trying hard to hide. "Daddy?" Her voice was small, uncertain. "I heard there might be trouble tonight." Frank's heart clenched. His little girl, though she was 26 now and a star in her own right with "These Boots Are Made for Walkin'," was the one pure thing in his complicated life. He'd kept her away from the dark side of his world, but in Vegas, secrets had a way of bleeding through even the thickest walls. "Who told you that, sweetheart?" Frank tried to keep his voice casual, but Nancy wasn't fooled. She'd inherited his street smarts along with his musical talent. "Uncle Dean. He said there were some bad men asking questions about you. He said maybe I should go back to the hotel." Nancy stepped closer, and Frank could see fear flickering behind her brave facade. "Daddy, what's going on?" Frank had faced down mobsters, FBI agents, and Hollywood executives, but his daughter's concerned eyes nearly broke his resolve. He wanted to tell her everything about the letter, about Giancana, about the web of violence and loyalty that had trapped him for 20 years. Instead, he pulled her into a hug and held her tight. "Everything's going to be fine, baby. Your old man's been in tougher spots than this." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Frank had never been in a situation where his own family, the Chicago family that had made him and could just as easily unmake him, had marked him for death. "I want to stay and watch the show," Nancy said, pulling back to look at him. "From the wings, like when I was little." "No." The word came out harder than Frank intended. "You go back to the hotel and you stay there until I come get you. That's an order, not a request." Nancy started to protest, but something in Frank's expression stopped her cold. She kissed his cheek and whispered, "I love you, Daddy," before disappearing back into the corridor. Frank watched her go, wondering if that would be the last time he'd see his daughter alive. 10 minutes until showtime. Frank poured himself another bourbon, his third, but who was counting, and tried to steady his nerves. Through the thin walls of the dressing room, he could hear the crowd getting restless. The Copa Room held 400 people, and tonight every seat was filled. Movie stars, politicians, high rollers from around the world, all waiting to see Frank Sinatra perform. What they didn't know was they might be witnessing his funeral instead of a concert. The door opened again, and this time it was Count Basie, the legendary bandleader and Frank's musical collaborator for the past decade. The Count's dark face was grave, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by something approaching sorrow. "Frank, I heard about the letter." Basie's voice was low, careful. In their business, walls had ears, and even trusted friends could be wearing wires. "Maybe we should call this off. Tell them you're sick." "Since when has Frank Sinatra ever called in sick?" Frank straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of his reputation settling around him like armor. "Besides, you know as well as I do that running would just make things worse. If they want me, they can come get me on my own stage." Basie nodded slowly. He'd seen Frank's legendary stubbornness before, usually when it came to defending his artistic integrity or his personal honor. Tonight that stubbornness might get him killed, but it was also the only thing keeping him sane. "What do you want me to tell the boys?" Basie asked, referring to his orchestra. "Tell them to play like their lives depend on it. Tonight they just might. 5 minutes until showtime." Frank walked to the full-length mirror and adjusted his tuxedo one final time. The man staring back at him looked older than his 50 years, worn down by decades of late nights, hard liquor, and harder choices. But his eyes still held that spark of defiance that had carried him from the streets of Hoboken to the stages of the world. He thought about Ava Gardner, the woman who'd loved him and left him and taught him that even the strongest hearts could be broken. He thought about his mother Dolly, who'd scraped together every penny to pay for his first demo recordings. He thought about all the people who'd believed in him when he was just a skinny kid with a big dream and an even bigger voice. Frank Sinatra had lived his life his way, and if tonight was the end, he'd go out the same way. The door burst open and Jilly rushed in, his face flushed with excitement and terror. "Frank, we got a problem. Table 7 just cleared out. Rosselli and his boys, they're gone. But Agent Carter's still there and he's got backup." Frank felt a cold smile spread across his face. So the feds thought they could use him as bait to catch the Chicago boys in the act. It was a smart play, except for one small detail. Frank Sinatra wasn't anybody's pawn, not anymore. "Tell Count Basie to start with." "That's life," Frank said, straightening his bow tie one last time. "If I'm going out, I'm going out swinging. 2 minutes until showtime." Frank walked toward the door that would take him to the stage, each step echoing in the narrow corridor like a countdown to Judgment Day. Behind him he could hear Jilly's heavy footsteps, the man who'd promised to watch his back no matter what. Ahead of him lay the Copa Room stage, bathed in spotlight and surrounded by 400 people who had no idea they were about to witness history. The house lights dimmed, and somewhere in the darkness Frank knew a killer was waiting. Maybe it was one of Giancana's soldiers, maybe it was an FBI agent looking to close the books on 2 decades of surveillance, or maybe it was someone else entirely, a rival, a jealous husband, a fan driven to madness by obsession. But as Frank Sinatra stepped into the spotlight and felt the heat of the stage lights on his face, none of that mattered. In this moment he wasn't a mob associate or an FBI target or a fading star trying to hold on to relevance. He was simply what he'd always been, a voice in the darkness singing the songs that made the whole world listen. The opening notes of That's Life filled the air, and Frank grabbed the microphone like it was a lifeline. His voice, still strong after all these years, cut through the smoke and whiskey haze of the Copa Room like a blade through silk. "That's life. That's what all the people say," he sang, his eyes scanning the crowd for threats, for friends, for any sign of what was coming next. "You're riding high in April, shot down in May." The words had never felt more prophetic. In the front row, Frank spotted a familiar face. Mia Farrow, the young actress who'd been linked to him in the gossip columns. Her eyes were wide with something that might have been love or might have been fear. 3 tables back, he saw Johnny Carson, the talk show host who'd made Frank a regular guest and a friend. And in the shadows at the back of the room, barely visible in the dim light, Frank caught a glimpse of movement that made his blood run cold. But he kept singing because that's what Frank Sinatra did. When the world was falling apart around him, when friends became enemies and lovers became strangers, when death itself came calling, he sang. It was the one thing they couldn't take away from him, the one weapon they couldn't confiscate, the one truth that would outlive all the lies. As the song reached its climax, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in months: peace. Whatever happened next, he'd faced it on his own terms, in his own house, doing the thing he loved most. If this was his final performance, it would be one worth remembering. The last note hung in the air like smoke, and for a moment the Copa Room was absolutely silent. Then the applause erupted, 400 people on their feet, screaming and whistling and calling for more. Frank smiled, his first genuine smile in weeks, and reached for the microphone again. But the microphone cord had been cut clean through, dangling uselessly from the stand like a severed lifeline. And in that moment of absolute silence, as the crowd's cheers faded to confused murmurs, Frank Sinatra heard the sound he'd been waiting for all night, the click of a safety being released, somewhere in the darkness beyond the stage lights. The letter had been right. This would be his final song. But as Frank Sinatra stood center stage, bathed in spotlight and surrounded by the music that had defined his life, he realized something the letter writer hadn't counted on. Some songs echo forever, long after the singer has left the stage. And Frank Sinatra's song was far from over. What happened next in that smoke-filled Copa Room would become Vegas legend, a story of survival, betrayal, and the price of fame that few people know the real truth about. Frank's decision in those final seconds would change not just his own fate, but the entire balance of power between Hollywood, the mob, and the FBI. If this untold story of Frank Sinatra's most dangerous night moved you, hit that like button, because the voice deserves to be remembered for more than just his music. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Frank made the right choice that night? And don't forget to subscribe for more hidden stories from the golden age of Vegas, where every spotlight cast shadows that could kill.